Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to let some more people in, but in the meantime, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Hadley German, and I'm the Eugene B. Adkins Curator here at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first Coffee with the Collection of 2023. But before we get started, I'm going to go over a little bit of housekeeping. Your microphones are muted, and we ask that you keep yourselves muted during the program so everyone can hear without distraction. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, please feel free to do so using the chat feature. To open your chat, scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom window and click on the icon that looks like a speech bubble. A window will open to the side of your screen where you can type questions and comments, but be sure to hit return. Our presenters will field your questions during the Q&A session at the end of the program. Today's program is also available with closed captioning. To access the captions, click the CC button located on the bottom right of your Zoom window. Well, it's time to sit back, relax, and grab your favorite cup of coffee. Hopefully, you're sipping a roast by our friends at Yellow Dog Coffee, maybe even the Triumph of George, their limited edition roast inspired by the topic of today's presentation, Rembrandt's The Triumph of Mordecai. The roast is available for purchase for a limited time from Yellow Dog's store and website, and there should now be a link to their website in your chat window. Well, today we're fortunate to be joined by two special guests, Dr. Alan Levenson and Dr. Yael Lavender-Smith. Alan Levenson holds the Schusterman Josie Chair of Jewish History at the University of Oklahoma, and he serves as the director of the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies here at OU. Prior to moving to Oklahoma, he taught history, thought, and the Bible at Siegel College in Cleveland, Ohio for 18 years. And at OU, Alan regularly teaches Judaism, Genesis through Jewish eyes, and the Bible since the Enlightenment. He has published numerous books on Jewish history for academic and popular audiences, including, most recently, Joseph Portraits Through the Ages with the University of Nebraska Press in 2016, and just last year with Alabama University Press, Maurice Samuel, Life and Letters of a Secular Jewish Contrarian. We're honored to have you with us today, Alan. Dr. Yael Lavender-Smith teaches business communications at OU's Price College of Business. She has taught courses in classical literature, comparative literature, English composition, and Hebrew at the City University of New York, Yeshiva University, and New Mexico University. Prior to her position at Price College, Yael served as Hebrew language first and second year coordinator. Her research focuses on transformation and conversion narratives in the classical and early modern periods. Welcome, Yael. Last, but certainly not least, our third presenter today is the museum's own Amanda Boehm-Garcia. In addition to serving as Director of Learning and Engagement for the FJJMA, Amanda is Oklahoma's co-representative on the Mountain Plains Museum Association Education Board. A fine artist, accomplished printmaker, and self-proclaimed expert on bougie ketchups and tater tots, Amanda completed an MFA in printmaking in 2008 at the San Francisco Art Institute. She's laughing. I'm sorry, Amanda. Where she was also a Fulbright Fellow. Today, Amanda, Yael, and Alan will be discussing the Triumph of Mordecai, an etching by the Dutch master painter and printmaker Rembrandt van Rijn, now on view in the museum's Focus Gallery. Alan and Yael will also share with us about their current presidential dream course, The Artist's Bible, From Mosaics to Graphic Novels. But first, Amanda, we're going to let you kick off today's program by sharing about Rembrandt's etching process. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Hadley.
Oh, you're welcome.
Always very entertaining introduction. I'm really excited to start our conversation this morning by sharing insights with you all about Rembrandt's innovations as a printmaker through an examination into his etching, The Triumph of Mordecai. And then I'm going to invite our special guests, Drs. Yael Lavender-Smith and Alan Levenson, to join the discussion and share their perspectives. I do want to begin, though, by saying that I am not an art historian or an expert on Rembrandt, but as Hadley mentioned, I have my Master's of Fine Arts degree in printmaking, While a Fulbright Fellow in graduate school, I had the distinct honor to study with master printers from Crown Point Press in San Francisco. So my contributions to today's conversation is really my bread and butter, so I'm pretty excited. So let's dive right in. Rembrandt van Rijn lived from 1606 to 1669. He was a Dutch Baroque painter and printmaker. He achieved great acclaim both during his life and after as a master storyteller. Rembrandt was a realist, so much of a realist that some were put off by his unflinching and uncompromising depictions that led to a few critics to lament that he preferred ugliness over beauty. Rembrandt's ability to understand and portray the emotional depth of the human condition not only places him as a central figure in the Dutch Golden Age in the 17th century, but continues to inspire artists and art lovers to this day. Known as an artist of light and shadow, we can see in these paintings evidence of that style that was a defining characteristic of the Baroque period. Pulling from the shadows, Rembrandt beautifully illuminates visual narratives. His paintings exemplify a masterly use of intense light spilling into darkly lit backgrounds, portions of which become completely black with little to no indication of what lies within those shadows. While pushing the boundaries of the style with oil painting, Rembrandt simultaneously sought to create the same emotive atmospheric environments in the world of printmaking. In particular, he was drawn to the process of etching. During his artistic career, Rembrandt created a staggering 290 prints. His incredible use of dry point, the velvety black that he was able to produce, made his etchings highly sought after by print collectors during his lifetime and still to this day. Here we have examples of Rembrandt's first prints, which are pure etchings made without the addition of any other process except for an occasional dry point line, which he used only at this point as a corrective tool. Each time a change or an addition is made to a plate and then printed, it is called a state. Almost all of Rembrandt's etchings exist in multiple states, some as many as 10 states or more, evidence of his constant search for perfection. Rembrandt's first prints were portraits of his mother, as well as self-portraits and people he observed in the street. He created these prints rather quickly, learning the process along the way. Excuse me. Many artists working at this time used etching as a way to replicate their most popular paintings. By creating multiple prints of the same image, an artist's work suddenly becomes much more accessible, not only through their sheer numbers, but by selling prints at a much more affordable price than the expense that comes with purchasing a single painting. Here we have an example of one of the few times Rembrandt followed this practice. He began with the original painting on the left, then he drew the same image again on a plate, and after printing it, you'll notice the composition is a mirror image of the original. This is typical of most printmaking processes where the image reverses as a result of printing. As we just saw, Rembrandt did copy a few of his paintings into prints, but he primarily created his etchings as completely original images. Although he frequently created paintings and prints depicting the same narratives and themes, but in very different ways. We have a beautiful example of that here with the story of Esther represented in the painting on the left, as well as in the etching on the right. I have a feeling Alan and Yael may want to come back to this later, so I'm not going to say too much more right now about that. Okay, so let's take a really quick look at the process that Rembrandt used to create his etchings. I'm going to walk you through the basic steps here. So etching really begins with the printing plate, and you can use many different kinds of metal plates. Although zinc and copper is primarily used, Rembrandt really only made a couple of zinc plates. He used copper for most of his printing. So the first step is to apply a ground. This is either painted on or rolled on. And as you can see, I drew a little diagram here in the bottom left corner. And that just shows you that the ground covers the plate surface and protects it from steps that will happen here in a moment. I was able to also find Rembrandt's ground recipe that he used, and I've included that here. Rembrandt's ground would have been a little bit more of a paste-like consistency. And using something that is more of a paste allowed him to really achieve the fine detail that he was able to get. The second step is to draw your image into the ground. And by doing that, you use these scribe kind of pointed tools that we see pictured here. And if you look at my diagram, by drawing into the ground, you are removing the ground in certain areas where that line has been drawn. Where the line is drawn, the plate is now exposed. For our next step. So the next step is then to immerse the plate in an acid bath. There are many different types of acids that you can use, and each kind of produce a different effect. Most commonly used is a Dutch mordant, what I used in school, so it's a little bit of a nostalgic picture for me. But Rembrandt used a diluted hydrochloric acid, and this actually was a really slow etch, and so allowed him again to achieve a high level of detail. And so in my diagram here, you can see a little bit of what happens during the etching process. So with our exposed lines that have been drawn into the ground, once the plate is put into the acid bath, the acid bites, using the printmaking lingo, into the plate itself and creates these recessed lines. And inside these recessions is where the ink is going to sit for printing. Okay, so then you remove the ground from the plate, and now we're at the printing stage, or the inking stage, I'm sorry. So first you cover the entire plate in ink, and this pushes the ink into those recessed lines that have been etched into the copper. And then the next step is to remove the ink that is sitting on the surface, but leaving the ink inside those etched lines. And so you can do that by hand wiping, and also using a tarlatan, which is this cloth-like material. And this removes the excess from the surface. Hand wiping is kind of a refined, it takes a lot of experience to figure out the feel of that. And you use kind of this meaty section of your palm directly underneath your thumb. It's actually quite a sensitive area, and you can feel by sliding your palm across the plate where there's excess ink, and you can take it off with your hand. You have to be careful because you can at the same time remove the ink from inside the lines, and then you have overwiped your plate, and when you print it, there's not much there. So this takes a little bit of practice. But if you see in my diagram here, once the plate has been wiped clean, ideally the ink is only sitting inside those recessed lines that have been etched. And then we print. So then you put your plate on an etching press, and then with a damp piece of paper, the paper is damp so that it can be pressed inside those recessed lines in order to pick up the ink as it goes through the roller. And then you pull off the paper, and there is your print. So this is the basic process. So each of these steps that we just went through, in just about every single one of these steps, Rembrandt manipulated and pushed the boundaries of that process to create the amazing interplay of light and shadow that we can see here in the Triumph of Mordecai. Let's take a look at a few different ways that he was able to do that with this print in particular. So the first thing Rembrandt is really well known for, and we can see in this print, is his use of cross-hatching lines. So cross-hatching are these areas here where we have lines that intersect each other in different directions. And so you can create different values and tones through this cross-hatching process. And so, whoops, okay, sorry. So where we see here, the lines are farther apart from each other and don't necessarily intersect so much. We have a lighter value. Where the lines are closer together and intersect each other in greater frequency, the value is a lot darker. So just through the use of line can Rembrandt is able to create a high level of value and shadow. Okay, now something else I'm super interested in this print in particular is this area here through the archway. It is so much lighter in value than the rest of the entire print. And so I was wondering, okay, how was he possibly able to create that? So there are a number of ways, but I think there may have been two things happening. So one of them is by stage etching. And so that means that Rembrandt was etching his plate multiple times. And we do know that his plates went through multiple states. So he's reworking them, printing, reworking again, printing again. So it seems highly likely that he would put a plate through a multiple etch process. And so the way that that works, I have it in a little diagram again here. You can see during our first etch, every drawn line is the same depth. And so that means it will hold the same amount of ink, and the line when printed will be the same value. Okay, now in order to do a second stage, if we want to create lines that are darker than others, the way to do that is to cover the section you want to keep light with the ground, and then you re-etch the plate. And so what happens then, wait for my cursor, where the ground is, the first etched lines stay shallow. And then once you resubmerge the plate, the lines that are exposed become deeper. And so therefore will be darker. And so it's my idea that perhaps this section, in particular, the structure in the background, was covered with the ground before etched again. Another way to do it is by using a burnishing tool here. This is flat and kind of curved on the bottom. And so what happens when you press into recessed lines with this tool, you're in a sense sort of polishing and shallowing out those lines. So then they will hold less ink. So it's a way to make a section lighter. And if you do it pretty vigorously, you can also almost kind of erase a section as well. So it may have been a little bit of both things happening. Okay, this is my favorite part. So this is something that Rembrandt is so well known for, and that is keeping the burr in the copper plate. So burr kind of refers to, wait, let me back up. I'm sorry. This is through using dry point. I got too excited. So these are dry point tools that you can see pictured at the top here on the left. So they are very sharp tools. And so this is basically for carving directly into the copper plate. So this is not an etched line at all. This is not using acid. This is just carving directly into the copper. And so what happens when you do that is the copper kicks up what's called a burr. And so that's these sort of ridges that occur in the line. Now, a lot of artists at the time, they would remove the burr. So they would take those ridges off so that it would be a crisp and clear line. Rembrandt loved the burr. And the reason for that is because the burr will hold ink in three places: inside the recessed line, but also at each point of those ridges. And so then the effect that you are able to get, we can see here very clearly in this line on the sleeve of the robe of this gentleman, this fuzzy sort of nature is those 3 points that are holding on to all that ink. And printmakers to this day love the burr because I could tell you, you cannot create that in any other medium. There is no way to get the same effect in paint, in any drawing material. This is so particular to this intaglio process, and I just love it to death. Okay, so anyway, we can see that he's using a lot of that here, even in these sections here. The darkness is so fuzzy and rich and velvety, and the only way you can get that is by leaving the burr on the plate. Okay, I'll move on, or I'll keep talking about that all day. Okay, then the other thing that Rembrandt was particularly known for, especially at this time. So this print was created in 1661, and beginning in the late 50s, 1650s, Rembrandt was treating his copper plates at this time almost like a painting canvas. And so really leaving ink in certain areas to a really high degree in order to create a lot of depth. And so we can even see where there's ink that he's left on the plate on purpose before printing. So there's a lot of that in these dark sections here, in particular on the ground here, and even somewhat in the background. So he's not wiping the plate clean at all in order to really push that depth. And all of these things were not happening at the time. These are all innovations that Rembrandt was really responsible for and that continue in the printmaking world today. Whew, okay. So now I'm going to try to stop talking about printmaking, and I'm going to invite our friends, Doctors Yael and Alan. Please join us in conversation, and I'm going to just open this up to you and let you take it in any direction that you all see fit. Welcome.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you for inviting us for coffee with the collection. I'm always astonished by it. I've been here in OU nearly 15 years, and I still am finding out about new and wonderful programs that I hadn't known about, and this is one of them. So I thank you for having us, and thank you for that great overview of Rembrandt's print method. It's fascinating. I want to say a couple of things about Rembrandt as a biblical artist, and a couple of things about the Book of Esther and this particular moment in the Book of Esther, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and friend Yael to talk a little bit more about it. So, and I'm not an art historian. I am obviously an art lover. I'm mainly a scholar of the Bible and it's the Bible's impact on later culture. And I think it's really easy to say that while so many great artists have used the Bible as a source of subject material, just like Greco-Roman material, Rembrandt is one of the very few to have a vision of the Bible, and even for a vision of the Hebrew Bible. And when I say that, I mean that the Jewish elements in his understanding of the Bible are really quite evident and at the surface. Part of it is the product of his famously realistic style. Rembrandt lived in a Jewish neighborhood, the Breestadt in Amsterdam. I'm sure many of you have visited it. And he used a lot of, he was famous for using a lot of models from real life that he knew. And quite often he turned to his Jewish neighbors to present, not only in paintings that, screamed it, like the Jewish Bride or Jacob's blessing of Joseph's sons, but even in places where it's a little bit less obvious, like in David and Saul. He's clearly chosen a kind of swarthy, Sephardic-looking David to stand in for the biblical character, whoever, we don't really know what any of these biblical characters really look like, and it doesn't really matter. But it's interesting that Rembrandt often went to his Jewish neighbors as models, but it's not only a product of his neighborhood. I think it's also Rembrandt's vision of the Bible, and is also, I think, clearly the product of the era he lived in. Rembrandt's life more or less overlapped the period of the 30 Years' War. The acme, or nadir, I guess would be more accurate, of the Catholic-Protestant conflict in Central Europe. And it was an era in which Bible reading and careful Bible reading had become really quite typical for European intellectuals. It's, a few decades after Luther was active, a few decades after the invention of the printing press, which really, for those of you who are interested in science and technology, you cannot understand the growth of literacy without understanding the role the printing press played. And there's no such thing as understanding European literacy without understanding that meant first and foremost biblical literacy, because that was, if there was only one book that you could read, that would be it. The Bible, or the Psalter, the book of Psalms. And so there's a lot that feeds into Rembrandt's biblical vision, his neighborhood, his era, and I think it's also really, to me, very, very evident. I think it's evident to anybody who looks at Rembrandt that he's not obsessed, as say the Italian Renaissance was, with looking back to Greco-Roman models. He chooses models from real life scenarios, real life interactions. And it's also, again, striking to me as a Jewish scholar of the Bible, how often Rembrandt will resist a kind of Christian typological reading of a particular biblical scene. Often it's the easiest thing to do and the most attractive thing to do, but I'm struck by how often Rembrandt chooses not to do that. To just give you one example, not this one, but just one example that I think an oil that probably many of you are familiar with. It's one of my favorite paintings, and I mentioned it already, Jacob's blessing of Joseph's sons. Not only does he engage in this wonderful act of creative exegesis or creative betrayal by putting Joseph's Egyptian wife, Asenat, prominently in the picture, but he also, when Jacob blesses Ephraim and Manasseh, almost all artists up until then, including Rembrandt's contemporaries, always had Jacob's hands crossed, and that visual typology, for whatever reason, and I don't know, Rembrandt doesn't do that and has his hands on Ephraim and Manasseh and reverses the primogeniture and makes the younger come ahead of the older, which is, of course, a major Genesis theme. But he resists this Christological reading. It's just astonishing to me that he resists that he resists the backward glance, that he draws on characters from his own life and times. And again, he is always, to me, an extraordinarily careful reader of the Bible, in addition to his artistic genius. So let me just say a word about the Book of Esther and this particular scene, the Triumph of Mordecai, and then I'll turn it over to Yael. And I just, for those of you who are a little bit, but not very familiar with Esther, one of the striking things about the Book of Esther, it really is a confounding book in terms of genre. In other words, in a Christian Bible, it appears along with the histories. But in a Jewish Bible, Esther appears along with the other 4 holiday scrolls. Here they are, the 5 holiday scrolls. And that canonical placement of Esther really affects how you read it, because is it a history? Is it a farce? Is it a burlesque? It really is kind of hard to say, I think. And it depends a little bit in the context in which you're reading it. For Jews, at least, Esther, the Book of Esther, is not distinguishable from the holiday of Purim, which is a couple of weeks away, in which you carry the scroll of Esther to the synagogue, you read it out loud, and it's really kind of Jewish Halloween in some ways, in terms of the fuss and the muss you make at Purim. And to just give you one, probably the most dramatic example, when you're reading the scroll of Esther in synagogue, you either use a noisemaker, or if you couldn't afford a noisemaker, or if it was the old world in America, it wasn't America, hadn't produced all these noisemakers en masse, so you would just take off your shoe and pound the table every time you heard the word Haman, the bad guy, who is the figure here leading Mordecai through the town. And so the genre of Esther is really fascinating and confounding, and the meaning of Esther has meant different things to different communities: Jewish, Christian, powered, disempowered. And it's also a book. It's named after a woman. There are only 2 biblical books That and Ruth are the only two named after a woman. And it's also the only book that doesn't contain the name of God, which is probably one of the reasons why the folks at the Dead Sea Scroll, the Dead Sea, don't have it in the library. Every other biblical book is in the Dead Sea Scroll library, but not Esther. And I think it's pretty clear. They were the fundamentalists of their day, and they really couldn't stand a book that didn't have the name of God and was so tongue-in-cheek about what was going on. So I'll just say one, I'm sure you realize I could go on about this quite a long time, but I'll just say one more word and then turn it over to Yael, and that is Rembrandt. And from my point of view, again, I'm not an art historian, but I am a lover of Rembrandt in particular. He chooses a very particular moment to portray, at least in this print, and that is near the end of Esther chapter 6 verse 11, I would say, where we have the great overturning of events. Up until then, up until chapter 6, it looks like it's going to go really bad for the Jews of Persia, and they're going to be wiped out. And then in this chapter, King Ahasuerus awakes from a dream and says, bring me my records, bring me my books. And in the books, he finds this guy Mordecai has unveiled a plot to do away with the king. And he says, what have we done to honor him? The answer is nothing. And he says, then to Haman, the guy in the front of this picture, who is his main advisor, what should we do to honor this great helper to the king? And Haman, thinking it's him, says, we should put him on a horse. We should put him in a turban or a crown. We should parade him through the city. We should give him all these honors. And the king says, great. There's Mordecai the Jew. I want you to walk him through the town, just like you said, don't leave out a detail. And so this is the great moment of reversal. In Hebrew, it's hafoch. This is the great lahafoch, in which time Mordecai is brought forward. And by the end of chapter 6, it is clear that that Haman is not going to succeed in his genocidal plan, and that in fact the Jews are going to do just fine. And in fact, the end of the book of Esther, for those of you who aren't familiar with it at all, is all about how we're going to celebrate this holiday Purim from now and forever. And so far, that's up until 2023 or 5783, whatever you prefer. Okay, I'm going to stop before I go on and say, Yael, why don't you take it from here?
Thank you, Alan. So first of all, thank you for having us. I'm excited to be here. As Alan and Amanda mentioned, I'm not an art historian. I'm coming from a comparative literature, and what I'm interested in talking about is, why did Rembrandt focus on the book of Esther? Why Esther? And first of all, we can see her in this etching on the top right, sitting there right next to the king Ahasuerus. And she's an interesting figure. She has a book named after her because of her resourcefulness and courage. But moreover, this scene from the book of Esther was directed towards the audience of the time, that is the Jewish community that settled in Amsterdam during the time. So what do we know about them, and why this scene is so important for that specific audience? Esther, because of her courage, but also as a result of hiding her Jewish identity, Mordecai asked her to hide her identity, and she is a figure who married the king and is able to save her people. She became an image of heroism for the conversos community in the Iberian Peninsula. Who are the conversos? The conversos are Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity after the 1492 edict and in Spain, and then 1497 in Portugal. So some of the Jews fled and settled elsewhere, but those Jews who remained in the Iberian Peninsula converted to Christianity, but some of them, many of them, kept practicing Judaism in secrecy, and adopted some customs from Judaism. For them, for this community, Esther was a heroine. And as time elapsed, the connection to Judaism and to the original practice, without Hebrew books, without Jewish education, they were more and more distant from the oral tradition and the Hebrew Bible. However, they maintained certain practices. For example, there was the fast of Esther. So Jews fast for one day, but the conversos community fasted, for example, for 3 days to commemorate some certain elements of the book of Esther. So from their point of view, Esther was a heroine, and they saw her image, they saw her as a figure to identify with. And Rembrandt depicts her here, elevated by the king as one deserving that respect and honor. We can even see a certain shadow on on the king's face, on Ahasuerus' face, but Esther is completely light, with no shadows to highlight her position. In addition to her role, the conversos, many conversos, left the Iberian Peninsula and settled in Amsterdam and found their way back to Judaism. So still they maintain that admiration for Esther. By the way, they actually admired her as and worshipped her, not worshipped, but treated her as Saint Esther. They had pictures of her, even though she was not adopted by the Catholic Church. She was regarded as Saint Esther. Last but not least, I would like to highlight that in terms of the painting itself, Esther and Ahasuerus are sitting there at the top, but it is Mordecai who is the center of the painting, of the etching. And one thing that I am wondering about is why the severe facial expression? Why is he, after all, there is a change of fortunes. Right now he is on the horse, carried with a certain respect. And I think that it is due to Rembrandt's real knowledge of the Book of Esther. I think it highlights his deep understanding of the moment in the Book of Esther where we are in between two banquets, a banquet that Esther is, the day before, Esther is inviting the king and Haman to a banquet to save the Jewish people from the destruction, but she's not actually asking the king of that. She's not actually requesting the king to save the people quite yet. She's very resourceful, and she just plants the seed. The banquet where she will actually ask the king to save her people and she will reveal her identity takes place that evening after the specific procession. So Rembrandt depicts the severity on Mordecai's face because he's still worried about the fate of his people. And I think his ability to capture this in this etching is a real testimony for his brilliancy. Thank you. I will pass it back to Amanda.
Thank you so much, Alan and Yael. Okay, I want to follow up what you said really quick. I think that's a really fascinating question that you were just asking about, this expression on Mordecai's face. And I was thinking just before you said that, I was noticing that, if we look at the king, and we also look at Mordecai, these are the only two individuals out of all these figures that are looking straight out at us, at the viewer, right? They're like making eye contact with us, and no one else is, which I'm not really sure what that means, or if I have a question there at all, but it's just something that I noticed that I hadn't really seen before, but it seems to go along with what you were just saying about that concern for at this point in the story, which I think is fascinating. Something I do want to point out to everyone is the two figures here. So, the King and Queen Esther. These are also, I want to let everyone know. So this is Rembrandt used himself here for the portrait of the king. And that is his wife that he used as the model for Esther, which I think is really kind of fascinating and interesting. He put himself in there. And he did use his wife quite often as a model. I did read somewhere that very rarely did he ever create a portrait of his wife where he's showing her just as herself. He's always using her in the place of another character for one reason or another. I think I'm going to go ahead and just kind of open it up now to the whole group for Q&A. If anyone has any questions that you would like to ask, I haven't even opened the chat. Maybe there's a few in there already. Please feel free to type anything you'd like to ask to Alan or Yael, or I will do my best to answer if you have any questions for myself. But while people are doing that, I think Alan and Yael, I have a question for you both. So Hadley mentioned in the beginning that, this print is currently on view as a part of our Focus Gallery installation and the Dream course that this installation supports. So I'm wondering if you can talk just a little bit about that course that this installation is in the museum as a part of that, and maybe if you could relate how this print relates to the class in one way.
Sure. I'll start, and Yael, you'll continue. Okay. I thought of this course several years ago when it seemed to me that a lot of our students, because of the state of art education in Oklahoma, may not really have much of a grasp on the artistic tradition. And I thought that, I occasionally would throw up a slide in one of my Bible classes, and it was very rare that the students knew who the artist was. So it was sort of a desire to do a little bit of art history, but also to link it to something that maybe they did have a better sense of. And since this is the Bible Belt, I thought maybe that would be a natural linkage, and that's after all what I teach. So I thought, that was the idea, is to follow the canon of the Old Testament, New Testament, which is of course the Bible that our students know. Needless to say, from a Jewish point of view, the Hebrew Bible is sort of a little more self-contained and doesn't have a New Testament component, but we certainly thought it needed to be included. So that was the original idea for the class. And Yael in 2019 was able to teach it for the first time. We thought this would be a great presidential dream course because both of us are Bible fans and art fans, but neither one of us is an art historian. So we applied for a presidential dream course just now and got it. And so now we're able to bring in, it turns out we got 4 great art historians from around the country, including Ann Jensen Adams from UC Santa Barbara, who did a book called Reading Rembrandt's Bathsheba, and she'll be speaking Tuesday night at the Fred Jones. And I want to thank Amanda and Hadley and Thomas Smith for being so welcoming to our class, and we get to use the great auditorium because, you know, if you're showing art, you have to have good optics, obviously, and that's not to be taken for granted. So we're really appreciative of that, and that's how that's the course. We try to do 4 or 5 different pictures for each session, and to illustrate different ways of interpreting a character or a verse or a scene. And it's working out pretty well. Our students seem to like it. So, Yael, you want to add anything?
Thank you. I'll just say that we like it too. It allows us to really compare the Bible and biblical scenes to the way artists represented them. And it's not necessarily, it's quite different than just reading the Bible and discussing the scenes, because it's more of the way artists visualize or they are able to choose and select those elements from the Bible that they can represent in these visual elements rather than text. So it's on the one hand challenging, on the other hand really interesting, and it's wonderful to listen to the students' perspectives and expose them to wonderful art.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we are more than pleased to have you all in the museum. You've really opened up our eyes quite a bit as well. Hadley, I can't see the chat on my end. Do we have any questions?
Sorry, I was trying to remember how to unmute myself. No, we don't have any questions. So any of you who would like to pose a question to our Bible scholars and printmaker, please do feel free to do that. In the meantime, there is another slide, and I wondered if you all would like to share it, since we do have a couple of Rembrandt prints in the collection. Alan.
Hadley, can I jump in? Because
Yes.
I did see a question in the chat, and it was about the political situation in the Dutch Republic. And I just, without knowing the answer in detail about this particular etching print, I'm not sure. Is it better to say etching or print, Amanda?
Either one suffice.
Okay. I don't know the answer for this exact etching or print, but I think it is fair to say that in Rembrandt's day and in the day of his slightly younger contemporary, Benedict Spinoza, the famous Dutch philosopher, the Dutch Republic was an anomaly in Europe. Most everything else was ruled by monarchs. The Dutch Republic itself was always in a precarious state because the Spanish Habsburgs were quite eager to reconquer it. Later in Rembrandt's life, the Dutch fought a war with England, but in Holland, in the Dutch Republic itself, Holland's only one of the provinces, but in the Dutch Republic, they were threatened by the Spanish Habsburgs, who were of course Catholic. They were also threatened by fundamentalist Calvinists who wanted to impose a theocracy of the sort that John Calvin had imposed on Geneva. And so the Dutch Republic was really, it was, I would say, a very political and very partisan era in which Rembrandt lived and created. So I guess I don't know the answer to the exact question, but it wouldn't surprise me.
If I may add one thing regarding the political context in comparison to the actual painting of the Triumph of Mordecai, there was also a Dutch audience for that specific painting because the story of Mordecai, or the story of Esther and Mordecai and Haman was figured also in the literature of the period, and one of our future speakers, Stephen Nadler, is discussing this in his book as well. So they figured in playwriting and in plays and in literature, they figured that they saw the figure of Haman as a representation of the Spanish and the figure of Mordecai and Esther as representations of the Dutch. They were in long conflict with the Spanish, so that painting especially did not only have a Jewish and converso audience, but also a contemporary Dutch audience. Thank you.
Wow, that's interesting. Didn't one of you say yesterday or earlier this week when we were talking that Mordecai is holding, is it the staff, or it has to do with his authority as a ruler? What could you remind me?
Yeah, I love this. And I will say, I mean, obviously he is holding a ruler's staff. And to me, this is just like a wonderful little illustration of a general thesis, which is always assume an artist of this sort knows exactly what he or she is doing. And this is not actually in the book of Esther. In other words, of all the description of what a ruler has, the horse, the garb, the crown, it doesn't say, and have him carry a ruler's staff. But I am as certain as I can be, without really knowing at all, that this is Rembrandt taking the very famous and well-known verse from Genesis 49:10, which is that the Messiah will not come until the staff departs from Judah's feet. You can look it up at Genesis 49:10. It was one of the most argued about verses in all of biblical exegetical history, and I am sure Rembrandt thought, if he's acting as a ruler, we got to put a staff in his hand. And so I just am convinced that that's what that is doing there. So that's probably what I was mentioning earlier this week.
Oh, that's fascinating. Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Alan, and also Yael. Looks like we don't have any additional questions, so I think we can go ahead and start to wrap it up. Thank you, both of you, for joining us this morning. And thank you for that thought-provoking and really kind of compelling conversation about this print. I'm going to go downstairs and look at it as soon as we're finished. So for those of you who don't know where it is, when you come in the museum, if you take a left, you'll see a gallery that's identified as the Focus Gallery, which is the location of this particular print. I want to thank our audience for joining us today, both to those of you who have joined for the first time and to those of you who have attended since the very beginning, 2.5 years ago. And we have a couple of you with us today, Patrick, Leslie, Christopher, Terry. Thank you so much. We're so happy that you have continued on this Zoom journey through the collection with us. Well, for those of you who would like to hear more about Rembrandt, we hope you'll join us on Tuesday, next Tuesday, for the free public lecture that is part of Yael and Alan's Dream Course. It's at 5 p.m. in the museum's auditorium. Again, that's February 21st. Yael and Alan will be bringing in art historian Ann Jensen Adams from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and she will deliver a lecture entitled Rembrandt's Empathy, a Personal Response to Biblical Narratives. If you're unable to attend in person, you can also join that lecture over Zoom, and there should be more information in your chat window about the lecture and the Dream Course lecture series. We also invite you to save the date for the next Coffee with the Collection, which will be held on Friday, April 28th. A member of the School of Music faculty will join me in discussing a recent gift to the museum, that is painter Nikolai Feshin's expressive portrait of the Russian composer Ariadna Mikashina. Well, until then, I hope you all stay safe, stay warm, and have a wonderfully creative weekend. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan.